The German officers were certain they were being flanked. Every shot came from a different angle, left then right then high then low, bullets striking from positions that made no tactical sense. Hitting targets that should have been protected by cover, finding flesh in spaces that every doctrine said were safe, and the pattern of kills traced geometric impossibilities across their defensive perimeter that suggested either multiple coordinated snipers working in perfect synchronization or something far stranger, something that violated everything they understood about ballistics and line of sight, and what they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed even if they'd captured the shooter and examined his weapon, was that the sniper hunting them was firing through a scope that was technically broken, misaligned by artillery concussion 3 weeks earlier when a German 105mm shell had landed close enough to throw Senior Sergeant Alexei Morozov 6 feet through the air and leave his ears ringing for 2 days, close enough to crack the wooden stock of his Mosin-Nagant and knock the PU scope's internal mechanisms slightly askew in ways that weren't visible to the naked eye but were catastrophically significant to precision shooting, creating a cant in the reticle and damage to the windage drum that made the crosshair track inconsistently, that turned what should have been a perfect optical instrument into a liar that showed targets in one place while bullets struck somewhere else entirely, and what began as a flaw that should have ended Morozov's effectiveness as a sniper instead became a trick shot so devastating that the Germans rewrote their movement routes and patrol patterns and even their doctrine for covered positions just to avoid the killing zone of a weapon they couldn't understand, couldn't predict, couldn't defend against because they were trying to solve the wrong problem entirely. The setting was the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942 approaching 1943, somewhere in the frozen hell between Leningrad and Smolensk where villages had been reduced to rubble and skeleton walls, where snow fell through roofless buildings and accumulated in drifts that hid bodies and equipment and unexploded ordnance, where the temperature dropped so low that rifle bolts froze and had to be worked manually with hands that lost feeling after 30 seconds of exposure, where fog rolled through shattered forests and turned every tree lean into a gray mystery where death could hide, where the ground alternated between frozen mud hard as concrete and slush deep enough to swallow a boot, where every breath crystallized in the air and gave away positions, where the smell of cordite mixed with wood smoke from fires that soldiers huddled around despite knowing the flames made them targets, where survival meant being smarter and colder and more patient than the enemy. And this was Alexei Morozov's world. This was the environment where he operated with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent his pre-war years as a hunting guide in the Ural Mountains, who'd tracked bears and wolves through terrain that would kill unprepared men, who understood weather and wind and how temperature affected powder burn and bullet trajectory, who'd learned to shoot as a child using his grandfather's ancient rifle and had developed an intuitive understanding of ballistics that couldn't be taught in any military school, who approached sniping not as a technical skill to be learned from manuals but as an extension of hunting, as a patient observation of patterns and habits and predictable behaviors that could be exploited by someone willing to wait hours in freezing cold for a single perfect shot. When the artillery shell knocked his scope off zero, Morozov's first reaction was frustration bordering on rage. Not at the Germans who'd fired the shell, not at the randomness of war that had damaged his most important tool, but at himself for not having a backup, for not protecting the rifle better, for allowing circumstances to compromise his effectiveness. And he'd immediately tried to re-zero the scope using standard procedures, firing at known distances and adjusting the turrets, but something was wrong with the internal mechanisms in ways he couldn't see or fix in the field. The windage adjustment moved inconsistently, clicking through positions that should have been precise but instead seemed random. The elevation worked but the horizontal tracking was compromised. And after burning through a dozen precious cartridges trying to zero the scope, he realized with cold certainty that the optical instrument was fundamentally broken, that the crosshair showed one thing while bullets landed somewhere else, that shots that should have been perfect center mass hits were missing by inches or feet depending on range, and the pressure from his company commander was immediate and unforgiving. Make it work or get a replacement. But there were no replacement scopes available anywhere in the division. Supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Specialized optical equipment was rare enough that snipers were expected to maintain their weapons indefinitely. And even if a replacement existed somewhere in the rear echelons, it would take weeks to requisition and transport through a supply system that was barely keeping ammunition and food moving to the front. So Morozov was faced with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Operate with broken equipment or don't operate at all. Remain effective despite the flaw or become just another rifleman. Maintain his value as a specialist or lose the privileges and responsibilities that came with being one of the regiment's designated marksmen. The key insight that changed everything came not from technical expertise but from Morozov's hunting background, from years of compensating for wind and elevation and moving targets, from an intuitive understanding that ballistics follow patterns even when those patterns aren't what you expect. And instead of trying to force the scope to work correctly, he began to study how it worked incorrectly, began to understand its lies, began to map the relationship between where he aimed and where bullets actually struck, and he approached this with the methodical patience of a scientist conducting experiments, firing at fence posts and rubble piles and abandoned equipment, noting carefully where each impact occurred relative to his point of aim, documenting the deviations, discovering that the scope's flaw wasn't random chaos but predictable deviation, that bullets consistently curved relative to where the crosshair indicated they should go, and the pattern he discovered was both strange and exploitable. At 100 meters, targets appeared slightly left of where bullets struck. At 200 meters, the vertical rise created additional horizontal drift. At 300 meters, impacts were consistently right of aim point, and these deviations followed a curve that could be mapped, could be learned, could be compensated for through mental calculation rather than mechanical adjustment. And Morozov realized with sudden clarity that what he was looking at wasn't a broken scope at all, but rather a different kind of tool, a weapon with unconventional ballistics that could be mastered through understanding rather than repaired through replacement. The technical explanation for what was happening involved the interaction of several optical and mechanical flaws. The scope's reticle had been knocked into a slight cant, meaning the crosshair wasn't perfectly vertical relative to the bore axis, which created a lateral deviation that increased with range. Parallax error from the damaged internal lenses meant that the relationship between the shooter's eye position and the reticle wasn't consistent, adding another layer of deviation. The damaged windage drum created inconsistent corrections that compounded rather than fixed the basic misalignment. And all of these factors combined to create a bullet path that curved predictably but non-standardly relative to the point of aim, following a trajectory that no German soldier or sniper would expect because it violated basic assumptions about how rifles worked, how scopes functioned, how bullets traveled, and Morozov understood something crucial that separated him from other snipers who might have encountered similar problems. He didn't correct the scope, he corrected his understanding of it. He built a mental firing table that mapped point of aim to point of impact across different ranges and angles. He memorized the curve the way a musician memorizes scales. He practiced until the compensation became instinctive, until he could look at a target and know without conscious calculation where to place the crosshair to make the bullet strike true, and the broken scope transformed from a liability into something far more interesting. A weapon that behaved in ways the enemy couldn't predict, anticipate, or defend against. When Morozov began using the broken scope tactically rather than simply compensating for its flaws, he discovered advantages that would have been impossible with perfectly functioning equipment, and the first advantage was angle illusion. By deliberately aiming off target and allowing the scope's deviation to curve bullets onto target from unexpected directions, he could make shots appear to come from positions where no sniper could physically be located, could make Germans think they were being flanked when he was firing from a single position, could create the impression of multiple shooters working in coordination when it was just one man with one rifle exploiting optical lies. And this psychological effect was devastating to German morale and tactical decision-making because soldiers who can't identify where fire is coming from can't return fire effectively, can't call in counter-battery support accurately, can't organize assaults against phantom positions, and officers who think they're facing multiple threats divide their attention and resources in ways that make them vulnerable to the actual threat they're ignoring. The second advantage was counter-sniper confusion, because German marksmen who were trained to hunt Soviet snipers used standard doctrines that assumed rifles fired where they aimed, that bullets traveled in predictable ballistic arcs from shooter to target, that muzzle flashes and sound signatures indicated firing positions accurately, and when Morozov's bullets curved onto targets from angles that didn't match where he was actually positioned, German snipers would hunt the wrong buildings, watch the wrong windows, stake out positions that offered no line of sight to where impacts occurred, wasting hours and days searching for a sniper who wasn't where physics said he should be. And several times Morozov watched through his broken scope as German marksmen set up elaborate hides to cover positions they thought he was shooting from, positions that would have been perfect for conventional sniping but were useless for intercepting his curved fire, and he killed those counter-snipers from angles they never considered because their training and experience told them those angles were impossible. The third advantage was the movement trap, and this was where Morozov's hunting experience transformed tactical confusion into systematic slaughter, because he understood that prey animals don't just react to immediate threats, they anticipate danger and move to what they perceive as safety, and German soldiers were the same. When they identified a firing position, they moved to cover that protected them from that specific angle. They adjusted their routes to avoid line of sight from that position. They established patterns based on where they thought the threat originated, and Morozov could predict these corrections, could anticipate where they would move when they thought they'd identified his position, could place his crosshair on empty ground knowing that in 30 seconds a German soldier would run across that exact spot seeking cover from a threat that wasn't where they thought it was, and he killed men not where they were but where they were going to be, turned their own tactical intelligence and defensive instincts into weapons against them, made their training and doctrine and reasonable assumptions about ballistics into vulnerabilities that he exploited with methodical precision. From the German perspective, the situation was approaching psychological warfare, was creating a paranoia that spread through units like an infection, because the reports coming back to officers didn't make sense. Bullets were striking from angles that shouldn't exist, targets behind solid cover were being killed by shots that seemed to curve around walls, sentries positioned to watch specific approaches were being hit from directions they weren't monitoring, and when officers tried to piece together the pattern, they kept arriving at the wrong conclusion that there must be multiple snipers working in perfect coordination, that the Soviets had developed some kind of new tactic or special unit, that they were facing an elite threat that required immediate countermeasures, and the paranoia fed on itself as soldiers began to distrust their own understanding of cover and concealment, began to question whether any position was truly safe, began to move with the jerky unpredictability of men who know they're being hunted but can't identify the hunter, and unit cohesion suffered as soldiers became reluctant to expose themselves even for necessary tasks, as officers struggled to maintain operational tempo when every movement drew fire from impossible angles, as the simple presence of one Soviet sniper with a broken scope created a disproportionate drain on German combat effectiveness. The core set piece that broke German tactical confidence came during a staging operation when a reinforced platoon was preparing to assault a Soviet-held building complex, gathering in what should have been a perfectly safe assembly area behind a stone wall that blocked line of sight from all identified Soviet positions, with officers conducting final briefings and checking equipment while soldiers smoked cigarettes and tried to calm pre-assault nerves, and Morozov had been watching this position for 3 hours from a height 600 meters away, had identified the patterns in their movement, had noted which officers gave orders and which soldiers followed them, had calculated firing solutions that accounted for range and wind and the peculiar curve of his broken scope, and he'd selected his target with the cold calculation of a hunter choosing which animal in a herd would be easiest to kill, a German Hauptmann who kept standing in the same spot to consult his map, who had a habit of pointing with his right hand while giving orders, who was protected by the stone wall from every conventional firing angle but was exposed for 2 seconds every time he gestured, and Morozov had waited with the infinite patience of a man who'd once spent 8 hours in a tree stand waiting for a specific buck to walk into range, had controlled his breathing and heartbeat, and even his thoughts, had become less a person and more a mechanical system designed for one specific purpose, and when the Hauptmann made his gesture for the 3rd time, Morozov squeezed the trigger with the smooth steady pressure that left no disturbance, no jerk, no indication that would throw off the shot. The bullet left the muzzle at standard velocity for the 7.62x 54 mmR cartridge, began its arc through cold air that was dense enough to affect trajectory in calculable ways, and instead of traveling in the straight line from rifle to target that a normal scope would have indicated, the bullet followed the curve that Morozov had mapped through weeks of experimentation and compensation, rising slightly as it covered the first 200 meters, beginning its characteristic drift at 300 meters, curving through space in an arc that took it not toward where the Hauptmann was standing but toward where he would be when the bullet arrived, and the shot appeared to come from an angle 45 degrees off Morozov's actual position, appeared to curve around the stone wall that should have provided complete protection, and the 7.62 millimeters round struck the German officer in the upper chest with enough energy to punch through ribs and heart and exit through the back, and he dropped without sound, without even understanding he'd been shot, dead before his brain could process pain signals, and for 3 full seconds the German soldiers around him didn't react because they couldn't process what had just happened, couldn't understand how a shot had found their commander in a position that had no line of sight to any Soviet position. The panic that followed wasn't immediate explosion but rather a progressive collapse of tactical discipline as soldiers tried to understand the impossible, as they scattered seeking cover from a threat they couldn't identify, and in scattering they exposed themselves to follow-up shots that Morozov had already calculated, had already aimed, had already prepared to take in rapid succession because he knew panicked men move predictably, run toward cover that looks safe without thinking about angles and line of sight, and he worked through his targets with the mechanical efficiency of a butcher processing livestock, compensating for his scope's curve without conscious thought, placing crosshairs on empty air and waiting the fraction of a second for bullets to curve onto running men, and soldiers fell in sequence. One trying to drag the Hauptmann's body to cover, another shouting orders nobody followed, a third attempting to identify the firing position and pointing in exactly the wrong direction, and each death compounded the panic. Each impossible shot reinforced the terror of facing an enemy who could kill from angles that shouldn't exist. And within 90 seconds the planned assault had dissolved into chaos as surviving Germans abandoned the staging area and fled in directions they hoped would provide cover, and Morozov let them run because dead men can't spread panic but survivors who tell stories of impossible shots and curving bullets and snipers who can kill. Behind walls create psychological damage that spreads through entire battalions. The German after-action reports from this engagement read like paranoid fiction, described a sniper or multiple snipers using some kind of specialized ammunition or curved-bore weapon, speculated about experimental Soviet technology or special forces units, recommended extensive changes to patrol routes and assembly procedures and cover assessment protocols, and these reports filtered up through chain of command until staff officers were redirecting resources to counter a threat that didn't exist in the form they imagined, were developing countermeasures against phantom technologies, were teaching soldiers to distrust their understanding of basic ballistics, and the cognitive load of operating in an environment where bullets didn't behave as expected created mental exhaustion that degraded combat effectiveness across entire sectors, and all of this stemmed from one Soviet sniper who'd learned to master a broken scope rather than replace it, who'd turned a flaw into a feature, who'd discovered that understanding a weapon's lies could be more valuable than trusting its honesty. After the engagement, Morozov's technique was quietly shared among other Soviet snipers, though few could replicate it because it required not just a damaged scope but a specific type of damage that created predictable rather than random deviation, required the patience to map that deviation across multiple ranges and conditions, required the mental discipline to compensate instinctively without conscious calculation, required a hunting mindset that viewed the rifle and scope as tools to be understood rather than precision instruments that should perform identically, and Morozov himself refused offers to repair his scope even when replacement parts finally became available months later, insisted that the broken scope was now an advantage he'd spent too much time learning to abandon, that correcting it would make him less effective rather than more, that he trusted its lies more than he'd trust another scope's honesty because he'd proven those lies could kill, and he used that same scope through the rest of the war, through campaigns that took him from the frozen north to the streets of Berlin, through kills that numbered in the dozens or hundreds depending on which records you believed, through situations where the ability to shoot from impossible angles meant the difference between completing missions and dying in ambushes, and the scope itself became legendary among his unit, became an object of superstition that soldiers believed carried special properties, that snipers wanted to examine and handle hoping some of its magic would transfer to them, though Morozov knew there was no magic, only understanding, only the patient mapping of predictable deviation, only the willingness to trust mathematics and muscle memory over what eyes and instinct suggested should be true. In post-war years, when Morozov trained new Soviet snipers, he would explain the principle behind his broken scope trick, would teach them that ballistics are predictable even when unconventional, would emphasize that a perfect weapon is actually more predictable to enemies than a flawed weapon that's been mastered, would demonstrate how understanding deviation can create tactical advantages that standard equipment can't provide, would make them fire through damaged scopes and bent barrels and misaligned sights just to teach them that accuracy isn't about having perfect tools but about understanding whatever tools you have so completely that their behavior becomes instinctive. And some students understood while others thought the old sniper was crazy or traumatized or teaching outdated techniques. But those who understood carried that lesson forward into their own careers, into situations where equipment failed or got damaged or simply wasn't available in the specifications doctrine required, into moments where adaptability meant survival and rigid adherence to proper procedures meant death. And the lineage of that broken scopes lessons spread through Soviet and later Russian sniper doctrine in ways that were never officially documented but were passed down through training and stories and the kind of institutional knowledge that exists in the spaces between written regulations. The scope itself survived the war, though Morozov did not survive peacetime by many years. He died in 1951. From complications related to war injuries, from damage that the Eastern Front had inflicted on his body and that no amount of understanding or compensation could overcome. And the rifle and its broken scope ended up in a military museum in what would later become Volgograd. displayed in a glass case with a placard that described the weapon's history and kill count but said nothing about the scope being damaged, nothing about the trick shots and curved trajectories, nothing about how German soldiers had died to a weapon that shouldn't have worked, and visitors would walk past seeing just another misaligned sniper rifle among dozens of similar weapons, would read the basic statistics and move on to more dramatic exhibits, would never know that this particular scope had been technically broken, that it had killed through its flaws rather than despite them, that it represented a philosophy of warfare that valued understanding over perfection, adaptation over standardization, individual skill over equipment specifications, and that somewhere in the careful examination of how tools fail is the seed of how they might succeed in unexpected ways. The closing thought that echoes through this story, that reverberates in every tale of battlefield innovation and desperate adaptation, that speaks to something fundamental about human conflict and survival, is that mistakes in war usually kill, that damaged equipment gets soldiers killed, that malfunctioning weapons get users killed, that broken tools are liability rather than asset in an environment where perfection barely provides enough advantage to survive. But sometimes, in those rare cases, where a mistake is understood more deeply by its user than by enemies, where a flaw is mapped and mastered and exploited with such completeness that it becomes indistinguishable from intentional design, where what should be a vulnerability transforms through understanding and practice into a capability that enemies can't counter because they don't even know it's possible. In those moments, a broken tool becomes the deadliest weapon on the field precisely because it violates all assumptions about how such tools should work, and Alexei Morozov's broken scope stands as testament to this principle, as proof that understanding beats perfection, that adaptation beats standardization, that a flaw that's mastered is more dangerous than conventional excellence, and that sometimes the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, between being hunted and being the hunter, comes down not to having the best equipment but to understanding whatever equipment you have so completely that its very failures become your enemy's doom.